Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Learn with Jason. Today on the show, we've got Scott Gell. Scott, how you doing?
Hey, I'm great, Jason. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm super excited to have you on the show. I think this is going to be a really fun one because, um, I feel like maybe people don't know about this, but one of my favorite tools is WebPageTest because it lets me get all of this really good insight into the things that I work on completely for free, right? Like it's sort of like a lighthouse test plus plus, right? Because it gives you so much more information. Um, and that is what you work on at Catchpoint, right?
Yeah, I'd have to agree, as a user for a lot longer than I've worked for Catchpoint, that I'm a big fan too. But yeah, yeah, I work at WebPageTest, senior experience engineer on the team, and I've been working on the new direction of the product. We just had a pretty big upgrade, I guess, of features, both free and paid.
Yeah.
And yeah, yeah, I think you described it pretty well. It's similar in some ways to Lighthouse. We run Lighthouse, so I think it's sort of
Hmm.
a complement in some ways.
Absolutely.
Um, and yeah, cross browser, different devices around the world. So yeah, it's got its own unique offering.
Yeah, for sure. I think well, actually, I got ahead of myself because what I should have done is I should have asked about you. Do you want to give us a bit of a background on yourself before we dive into Catchpoint webpage test?
Sure. Yeah, so I've been making websites for a couple decades, I guess, at least. And the last I guess about 9 months ago, maybe or so, I joined Catchpoint on the web page test team. And prior to that, I had been with Filament Group, design agency out of Boston, for about 15 years. So
Hmm.
I don't move around much. But uh, yeah, so at Filament, I think we would do work for clients, and we had a lot of really interesting work over the years through that. And I think in recent years we had started going in the direction more and more of doing audits, like from a performance and accessibility perspective, which paired with, I guess, our interests of in those areas that we had been working on for a long time prior to that. And so we would use web page test all the time. And I think a lot of that consultant kind of experience led me to the sorts of things that I care about working on for Catchpoint now.
Very cool. Yeah. So I think 15 years at one company is like it's kind of boggling my mind
It's
because
kind of
it's so
well.
wild because now when you hear that somebody's been in a company for like they hit their fourth anniversary there, you're like, wow, you're really committed to staying at one company. It's just
Yeah,
the world
yeah.
is very different, right? um
Yeah, I think the nature of working for a company that does a different project every 3 to 6 months
yeah,
keeps it pretty interesting.
that's fair, that's
Yeah,
fair. I
and it's
and
a great team over
I think
there.
that's the bigger thing, right? Is when you find a team that's just wonderful to work with and that treats you well.
Right.
It's I don't know. I think you can get swept up in this idea that there's a perfect company out there, but all companies have their flaws. You just kind of are trying to find the one that doesn't make you actively feel bad about yourself every day. Um, all right, so that's a rabbit hole we probably shouldn't go down. Let's talk a little bit about so you said you were a web page test user before you joined the company. I've been a web
Mm.
page test user for a long time. Chat, have you tried this before? Have you used web page test? Um, so for folks who haven't seen it before, I described it as Lighthouse plus plus. I think do you maybe want to give just a kind of a high level of what type of information you get when you run a web page test, or actually even more like what is actually happening, because I feel like it's a little different than when you use the dev tools to run a lighthouse test or something like that.
Yeah, yeah, it is a little different. So just from the homepage of webpagetest.org, you can kick off a variety of different kinds of tests from the default, I guess, which would be a site speed sort of performance test.
Hmm.
You can do visual comparisons between two different pages, where you would get like timeline views and be able to see how they load differently visually. You could test, you know, trace routes. There's a variety from the homepage, but I think the most common way to run it is to just put a URL in for any old site, and choose a location from. We have actual servers throughout the world that
Mm.
host our test agent, and those test agents can run browsers, with different connection speeds, and you can test from somewhere in Italy on Firefox on a Android device, or Chrome from China on a tablet,
Hmm.
things like that, and at a variety of different connection speeds, like 3G or 4G, or a cable wired connection. So you get the idea. There's a lot of variety there, and at a high level, I think the first thing that you get when you hit go, is it actually kicks off that test and tests it from that physical location, and you get a wealth of information about how the page loaded on that particular device from that location and speed. Um, and a lot of that is familiar, or will be familiar to you if you've run Lighthouse or something like that before.
Hmm.
You get upfront the sort of metrics that we typically talk about when we're talking about web page performance, which is like user centric sort of perceived
Right.
metrics, like how soon the page appears visually, renders in the on the screen, and how long it takes to become interactive to touch or click or keyboard. So things like that at a high level are what you see first.
Right. Right. So this is actually this might be, we can go as deep down this rabbit hole as you want to, but whenever you start looking at metrics like these, right, there's a lot that comes at you. So you start looking at what's the blanket core web vitals, right? And I don't know
Mhm.
which ones are exactly core web vitals and which ones aren't, but we start seeing things like first contentful paint, last contentful paint, time to interactive, first input delay. There's all of these different metrics that you see that come
Mhm.
back.
Mhm.
I find that to be kind of overwhelming, and I don't think I'm alone
Sure.
in like, you get all this information, you just go, okay, I gotta see on my website. I don't really know, like, what do I do? How do I fix it? So how do you, when you look at these metrics, how are you prioritizing, or how are you kind of sorting through this data to turn the information into action?
Yeah, that's a great question. I agree uh, with your sentiment about the metrics. I think for a lot of users, there's actually more information than you need.
Mm,
Um, I like to uh, I like to start by looking at usually start render, or the first contentful paint kind of metrics. Just like I think it's the most natural user perceived sort of type of metric to look at, which is like when I hit a URL and hit go, how soon do I see something, right?
mm-hmm.
um, and just by looking at that metric, like say first contemptible paint, or largest contemptible paint, one or the two, um, it tells you a lot. I think
Right.
these metrics are uh, by nature sort of additive. So like if LCP, like largest contemptible paint, which is like the moment that the largest piece of content on the screen finishes loading,
Mm-hmm.
um, if that takes a long time, then there are a number of things that could have contributed to that. So you can start to step back and see, okay, well, was there a large gap between the first time something painted to the screen and that moment when LCP came in? Okay,
Right.
then I can start to think about, something's happening uh, kind of after the HTML arrives on the device, like additional requests are not efficient, something like that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, and like, these are things that we feel, right? So like first contentful paint is, I go and I enter something into the URL, I hit enter, and then I'm looking at the blank tab, right? And
Yep.
between
Mhm.
me hitting enter and something showing up on my screen, that amount of time, if I wait longer than I honestly, if I wait long enough that it's perceptual, I'm kind of like, is this site broken? Right? Like just that
Right.
thing in my brain
Right.
goes, wait, is my internet down? Like, and then I start wondering. So there's an immediate quality hit there.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is always, you load the site and you see like a header and then a whole bunch of blank space, and you're like, is the site broken? And then a giant photo pops in, and you go, oh,
Right.
right. And
Right.
so those
Right. Right.
those types of experiences, like these are metrics that describe that experience. Like if the
Yeah.
first contentful
You
paint
described
is,
them both.
yeah, right, first contentful paint is 5 seconds. As data, you might go, oh, I don't understand what that means. But like if it takes 5 seconds for you to go from I hit enter to there's anything, like literally anything on the screen, your site is
Right.
broken. Like you're like, oh
Yeah.
no, that's not good. And the same if like it's 5 seconds to get something on screen, but then 15 seconds to get the bulk of the content. Now you're like, oh boy, that's really bad, right? So
Right.
there's
Yeah.
there's it's I think that was the point where it started to kind of make sense to me, was when I really understood not just what these things were called, but like what the experience is, where those lines are drawn, the
Yeah.
of seeing, of experiencing a first contentful paint. And that's actually
Yeah.
something that I love about WebPageTest is the film strip view, because
Mhm.
it
Mhm.
helps show those a little more, like it lets me experience it, where it's not just somebody saying like, oh, your site took 7 seconds to load, and you go, well, 7 seconds isn't that bad. And then you look at the film
Right.
strip and it's like, actually
Right.
your site was showing like unstyled text for 4.5 seconds, and then it
Right.
popped in as
Right.
styled, and you go, oh, that's actually, I don't want that. I want to fix that.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think you really nailed it where these metrics define moments to
mm,
the user of the site, but they're a little more fine grained than just necessarily what you can see. Even if you were
right.
to see every keyframe,
Mm-hmm.
within that like 7 seconds, there's still more going on, right? Like a blank screen entirely from like 0 to 6 seconds may not just be um, you know, something concerning first contentful paint. It may be that the HTML arrived really quickly, but the browser was forced to wait to show anything to the user because of subsequent requests that it was making,
Mm-hmm.
and that's something that the user can't tell, right? So like we have tooling like web page test and Lighthouse that can give us a little more information about like what the blank screen
Right.
what's going on actually behind the scenes, because there may be a step or two in there that's still blank, but it's pretty meaningful, and it can be
Yeah.
optimized.
Well, and that actually, like, that reminds me of probably the metric that is uh maybe my biggest source of frustration is first input delay.
Hmm. Hmm.
Because thinking about that one, like if we put that into context, that's when you load the site and there's a button and you click the button and nothing happens. And you keep looking at it and you're like, wait, did that button click? And so you like click it again and nothing happens. And you're like, what the hell is happening? And then the site
Right.
pops a little bit. You go, oh, it was still loading something. And now the button's
Right.
interactive. And so you
Right.
have these super frustrating moments. And
Yeah.
like I can understand that I am frustrated, but I can't understand why all of that happened. And tools like this are going to
Hmm.
give me like, how do we see, I guess we'll kind of look at this later, but at a high level, how do you identify those types of slowdowns when you're kind of looking at the results? Where would you look to see how that's all happening?
Yeah, I mean that one's a big deal because you might end up getting charged twice for a product, for example,
Mm-hmm.
clicking the submit button or something. Yeah, I mean there's real user consequence to a lot of these beyond just inconvenience, and
Mm-hmm.
waiting. Um, but yeah, I mean it varies in the situation you're talking about where you click something and nothing seems to be happening. Typically, there's some level of JavaScript applied to that action that uh, you made in the browser, whether it's clicking or tapping something or a keystroke,
Mm-hmm.
and it's taking too long. Often it blocks, there's one thread and it takes up the whole thread, and there's nothing getting through until it finishes its task, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we can see that in the tooling. If you look at a web page test result, it'll show a little strip of as the page loads, here's the main thread, and it's sort of like a flame looking kind of
Mm-hmm.
graph, and you can see based on color coding what's contributing to filling up that main thread, and blocking it. And often it's JavaScript in the case that you're talking about. Not always. Sometimes, images, decoding images can be quite costly on the main
Mm.
thread. So other types of resources take their toll on it. But
Yeah,
more and more, I think we're seeing, in development in general, in the last 10 years, a lot more dependence on the client side to JavaScript.
for
And
sure.
now we're sort of seeing maybe a little movement. Maybe you've observed this too, back the other direction, like seeing, okay, I think we went a little too far. There's clearly a performance hit from all of this scripting. So what can we move, out of the browser and back to the server to kind of make things efficient again? Um, it's sort of a cycle, I think, in web development that happens over and over.
I think, yeah, I've heard it described as an upward spiral, right? And the thing that's interesting about it is that it seems like we kind of move from we find something exciting and we start working on it, and then we start to reach its limitations, and so we move over here and we start looking at like how can we work around those limitations, and so we get excited over here, but as we're
Mhm,
doing that, this thing is improving, right? So then
mhm.
we reach the limitations of this, and then we kind of cycle back and we go, oh, this is better now, let's work on this because we found all the
Right.
limitations over here, and then this is improving. So you kind of steadily go upward on moving back and forth between these concepts as each one improves in parallel. um, and it definitely is a little, it feels a little bit like the pendulum swinging between client and server. But what I've noticed is that we've seen we're not like throwing away what happened on the client. We're just letting go of the things on the client that were really heavy, right? Like we used to need to load all of React or all of jQuery or whatever the front end library was to do just about
Mhm.
anything because the browsers had so much normalization that was required. There were so many weird edge cases and things, but as browsers have kind of solidified on a spec and they're pretty good at being compliant with that spec, you need less and less JavaScript. So you can rely more on the platform, which means that stuff like using form submissions, which is, I know Remix is really excited about, being able to just like submit a form instead of having to use JavaScript to catch that form and then handle it in that script. Those sorts of things become possible because now you're not dealing with browser edge cases anymore. And I'm sure we'll find the limitations
Yeah.
of Remix and we'll start solving them on the client, and then the platform will continue to improve and we'll head back. It just seems to be the way that we
Right.
roll. But that's good. That's how we move. That's how the march of innovation continues. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think, at Netlify, for example, among other companies, there's this push to move things to sort of like the closest version of a server, right? Like in edge locations where
right.
the latency is low, but you're
Mm-hmm.
still not doing everything in the browser where it's too costly,
Yeah, and also, when you do things in the browser, you introduce, you're offloading the burden to the user, right? You are
Right.
also introducing some variability because you don't know exactly how, like, Firefox's JS engine and Chrome's JS engine, they're going to be really close, but are they exactly the same? Probably not. Or like, is their connection getting interrupted because they're going through a subway tunnel or things like that are just hard to, it's just hard, right? Whereas if you put it
Right.
on a server, it's far more predictable, but then you're duplicating a lot of work, right? So I think a lot of the solutions we're seeing are trying to find that happy medium of, okay, well, let's put server like stuff near the user, like edge functions, serverless functions, things like that. And then let's also find ways to, do that work once when it makes sense so that we don't have to do it repeatedly. And so we see that
Right.
as pre-rendering, or in the case of things like SSR, you don't necessarily want to have to SSR a page every single time somebody loads it. That's why we used to get the Twitter fail whale or things like that is the servers would be over capacity and they'd fall over.
Right.
So if you don't need to do that
Right.
work more than one time, do it once and then cache it forever, right? So that's where
Right.
like Netlify has this idea of builders. We do on-demand builders where you build it once, we put it in the edge cache, and then it's just like a static asset as far as the
Yeah.
site is concerned. Or you can do caching headers, which is what Remix does. There's a lot of ways that you can kind of approach these
Mhm.
problems to get that dynamic opportunity without the burden of having to like actually do everything server rendered, which I think we've all, I mean, for the most part, agreed that that's not really the best way. That's kind of like,
Yeah, I mean, it's that classic. I mean, I think back to like the earliest time where I ran into this, even before we were doing Ajax necessarily, or fetching or templating or anything like that. It was
mm-hmm,
like form validation, right? Like
right,
you of course you have form validation on the server, but waiting for the server to parse your form and give you an error was such a pain that we
mm-hmm,
had to duplicate the logic on the client side as well. And usually it was written differently, like different languages, and now we have a little bit better sharing going on, but back then we didn't. So yeah, I mean, that's the earliest example I can remember, and that's still, frankly, we can do a lot more validation work without JavaScript now, like in
right,
HTML. So things have gotten better, but it's still kind of a concern, right? Like,
mm-hmm,
where does that logic live, and can it live in both?
right, right.
Maintain it. Mhm.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a really interesting space to be in, and it actually like what I'm excited about with this latest move toward this idea of edge compute is how many things that weren't possible before have become possible now, right? Like one of the things that I think about is I've been doing experiments with edge functions, and I was able to set up a plain HTML page that is like a link tree, right? And it's just a link to my social profiles, but then using an edge function without adding any JavaScript to the page. So the thing that's sent to everybody who loads the page is still just static HTML, but
Mhm.
I can pull a latest like Twitter follower count or video count or blog post count and enrich that button at the edge. Or you can do
Yeah,
like
that's neat.
geolocation, update the map to show somebody their neighborhood instead of like a generic neighborhood if you're a delivery business or something, right? Like there's so
Yeah.
many cool things that you can do without adding JavaScript,
Right.
or at least not adding client-side JavaScript. But
Mhm. Mhm.
I honestly, I think my favorite use case is, and I swear to God, this is not like because you're on the episode and I'm trying to big you up. It's the way that y'all have used them because it's so novel and so incredible. So let's talk about that for a minute, and then I really want to show it off. Can you
Yeah.
talk about like this new feature of testing code changes without changing code? How
Yeah.
how are y'all
So
building that?
yeah. So I mean, the short answer, I guess, is edge functions.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, as you noted. But yeah, I mean, this is something I think that the performance community, at least from my purview, has been building towards for quite a while. Uh, because for a long time. So first of all, we've had performance results that are giving you a lot of information, but not always, being clear about what exactly you should do about it, or how to
Mm-hmm.
prioritize, the information that you're getting, and what to fix, right? And some tools have done better than others in recent years to start to address that problem. Like Page Speed Insights, for example, was one of the early ones to give us like a lot of recommendations about, you know, if you pay attention to these blocking resources over here, they look like they're causing your page to be blank for a long time.
Mm,
Maybe you could load them in a different way. Here's what we would recommend, right?
mm-hmm.
That was, I think, a really, really big step, like to be able to provide that kind of, insight recommendation from like a performance expert. It's like kind of having your own consultant.
Yeah.
Um, and for a while, I think WebPageTest has always it started out as somewhat of a like a power tool, I think, and it still is. And its audience was more skewed early on towards people who were doing like deep performance audits and knew what they were looking at when they look at a performance result. And so we've been uh, over the last few years trying to expand without limiting its capabilities, but expand the audience that can understand what they're looking at in web page tests when they get a result.
Hmm.
So it's more, more user friendly, even to non-developers.
Right,
Um,
right.
and that's tricky to do, right? Because you're dealing with very, very technical, developer-oriented content.
Hmm.
But the concerns are, relevant to all of us, anyone who uses a website. So, and especially anyone who runs a website.
Right.
Um, so, yeah, long way around to get to this, but as we've been doing performance audits over the years, I think when we, as consultants, have identified ways that we could fix a particular bottleneck, there are a couple ways that we would approach testing that, right?
Right.
Because it's one thing to say that you think this is going to fix the problem, and another to actually demonstrate that it does or doesn't, and that's both useful to know. Um, and traditionally, that would mean, a number of things. You would either try to experiment with changes on a live website
Hmm.
by, say, like having maybe a query string flag that says like developer mode, defer these scripts and pass it a couple things, right? Something like
Right.
that.
Right.
And the change would actually happen in the live code base. And you'd have to, you know, change your production code base to support that, which is very risky, right? With a
Risky and
site
also
that,
just expensive. Like who,
yep,
what company is going to prioritize that kind of work? It takes a lot, right? You need
right.
buy-in at the
Yeah,
highest level to go in and make production code changes, and a lot of that is just so that you can prove that there is a problem, which makes it really difficult to get the buy-in because you're saying, "I'm pretty sure that we can fix this, but you got to let me do a bunch of pre-work to show you how bad it actually
exactly.
is." And
Yeah,
it's that's hard.
yeah. And in the process, maybe you'd introduce bugs,
Hmm.
security issues, which all of which are good reasons to not do the work. So
Yeah, yeah.
it was always, it was hard to get buy-in from, like, as a consultant, hard to get a company that we're working for to say, try this out. Here's what we want to try. So other ways to do it were, we would copy their code base like as best we could, host it somewhere else, and start manipulating that. Maybe make branches of it in GitHub and test each one manually, right?
Hmm.
Um, Obvious downside of that is you're not dealing with the live site, and all you can do is at best say, we think this will help because our, our copy behaves similarly to your site, and our optimized copy fixes it, whatever problem we're looking at.
Right.
Again, ton of
Yes.
work to do, even one optimization and test it. Okay. So, but we would do that all the time, right? And it would
Hmm.
limit, like, the amount of work that it involved to test each theory really was limiting to the number of theories we could test, right? So we would have like a handful at best of all-star optimizations that, we know from our expertise over the years are probably going to work, right? And
Yeah.
sometimes we were wrong, but we'd go to those first. So expensive work. The last part I'll say is we would, in recent years, write edge functions uh, by hand. So we would use a feature like Netlify has, um, or other companies have as well, that let you write kind of like a proxy, right, on the
Hmm.
on this on all of their edge server locations, that you could pass a site through, and it'll just make a little change as the site goes through, and makes its way to the browser. So maybe you request googlefonts.com, and it goes through, and we say, okay, find all of the images in the page that don't have a width and height attribute, and just add them and pass it on through, right?
Right, right,
um,
right.
that was a huge advance because the risk went away of
Hmm.
modifying a real site. But you introduce some new problems, which was, which necessarily or haven't necessarily gone away with new tooling. But you're not testing the live site, so that's good in some ways. But it's a simulation, right? Um,
Right.
but anyway,
Well,
huge amount of work.
it's a
It's
simulation
still a
and
huge amount of
yeah,
work.
just an unbelievable amount of work because like,
Right.
because out in the space right now you've got Netlify Edge functions are powered by Dino under the hood. So Dino is one of the big Edge providers, and then the other one's
Mhm.
Cloudflare Workers, and everything else is built on that. So like Vercel's option is white labeled Cloudflare Workers, Netlify is using Edge or Dino. And I think like Supabase is using Dino, and so you have to go use one of those tools. I think Dino's on an open spec, so it's all like MDN tools, but you gotta climb in, you gotta write this stuff by hand, you gotta figure out how this particular website is built so that you can transform it. There's so many little steps that like you said, it just means that you're not gonna do a lot of the tests. You're gonna do the big ones,
Right.
and then the
Right.
rest of them are
Right.
gonna be like, most of the time this works, so we're just going to do it. But you're not going to
Yeah.
validate that. You're just going to kind of like ship it and see what happens.
Yeah. And then, even if you get a test that's working pretty well, you have to remember to set up your environments the same way, make
Mm-hmm.
sure you do the same number of test runs through it. And also, you want to probably run your control runs, so to speak, so they
Right.
go through that same environment without modifying the site.
Right.
Because just passing through an edge worker is probably going to change some things about the way the page loads.
Well, if
So we
nothing
want to
else, it's a relay,
have
right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, but it's also, it could be closer to the device, latency wise than the server, the original server was,
Mm-hmm.
and the nature of how that super powerful edge server is proxying it might make it actually faster, like sort of like a CDN just to fetch it. So yeah, I mean there are just factors that make it make it fairer to compare apples to
Yeah.
apples, I guess. Yeah. Mhm.
So historically,
Yeah.
then just to kind of do a speed run of everything you just said, you originally you had uh, expert consultants who would have to manually do all of these tests either by modifying production, by scraping the content and making their own approximations of what production looks like, or by writing these edge proxies.
Right.
All of those
Yep.
are highly specialized, highly manual, highly expensive ways of doing it.
Right. Right.
And that's
Yeah.
why I think what you've done is so exciting. So let's talk about
Yeah.
what did you just
Yeah. So
introduce
there's
here?
some history to get to
Yeah.
this moment, but yeah. So what we've released in I guess it's been like almost 2 weeks now. So
Mm-hmm.
or yeah, just about 2 weeks. Is sort of twofold, right? We've added a section to test results that give you um, recommendations, sort of like the ones that I talked about with page speed insights. Although
Mm-hmm.
there are our own flavors of those audits that we run and recommendations based on what we find to be relevant
Mm-hmm.
uh, through our own experience. Um, and then depending on how those diagnostic checks that we run happen to go, we either say that things look good or we identify opportunities to improve. And when there are opportunities to improve, we can either recommend a tip if it's not something that we can change very easily ourselves. Maybe go off, try this in your own code base. Or the killer feature is being able to try experiments just by checking the box. So
And
I think you'll probably be sharing the screen at some point, but basically some of the optimizations that we were just talking about are as easy as saying, yes, why don't I try deferring these 4 JavaScript files that the tool says are causing my page to be blank for 4 seconds. Maybe
mm-hmm.
load them in parallel instead and show the page. And you can just try it out and hit go and get a little result page that compares your experiment to the original site, uh, both in a controlled simulated kind of proxy setting. So
Mm-hmm.
you're reliably testing a fair comparison. Um, it's just, it's many days at least of work saved
Right.
each time you click that button. So yeah, I'm pretty excited about it. It's
Yeah,
become kind of like video games to me.
I think
Just seeing what,
what I love
yeah,
about it is it's a flattening of the landscape to something that's more approachable, right? Like anybody who's ever heard me get excited about software, it's almost always because we've got an abstraction that makes something that was previously inaccessible more approachable for people who are everyday devs, not like ultra specialized, like a performance consultant or in the past when it was around front end, like the reason I get excited about tools like Netlify or tools like Remix or tools like Veet is because they're taking these things that were super complicated to do and building good abstraction so that you can
yeah,
do 80% of the best practices just by doing the default. Like all you have to do is
right,
show up and you've won, right? And this
right,
feels like one of those things where you now when you're doing perf testing, it's not just show me some numbers where I go, oh boy, it's not as good as I want it to be, but I have no idea how to fix it. It's well, here
yeah,
are my numbers, and did you know if you made this change and this change, it'll probably help. Do you want to try it and see the difference?
right,
That
right,
feels huge.
right.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah,
so
and I think it's there's kind of two, I think, audience considerations there that I think are really important. One is the enabling audience, right? Who was unable to either identify what to do or unable to test it if they had an idea what to do.
mhm.
Now they can, and they can then refer to their developer engineer team and say, we have this problem, and WebPageTest shows that if we add this attribute to these elements, it'll speed things up. It'll fix the problem. So if you could go off and do that, because that's not their role necessarily, but they know the right person to talk to, right? So
Right.
that's a new audience who could not do that prior to this tool. That's exciting to me.
Well, and it
But
saves the, we were talking about like just to get the data to make an argument for why you should make a change, you have to get buy-in at all these different
mhm,
levels because it takes too much work to set this up manually. So what I find exciting about this is it eliminates that step. You can now go and with very little buy-in, you can get a pretty solid hypothesis that like this is what we're doing now, this is how it would change, and this is the benefit we would get. We need X days or X weeks to go and solve this problem in our production code base. You don't
right.
need like an executive sponsor to do the exploratory work anymore.
Right, right, exactly. So yeah, I mean that aspect is a really big deal, I think. But I think before we go too far in sounding like we've replaced the consultant role, I think we've actually, as a consultant, I would be offended if that's what the
Sure.
tool did. Um, I think it's blown wide open the possibilities of what you can do and how much testing you can do as a consultant, um, because there's kind of two aspects to the experiment section, and a lot
Mm-hmm.
of them, the first aspect, so to speak, is sort of reactive, where
Mm.
it's identifying problems and suggesting an experiment you could try,
Mm-hmm.
and you have a little control over how that experiment is applied, but not a lot. Like it's very targeted, right? Um, but there's a whole separate section of that experiments page which is just open-ended, and this is sort of
Mm.
like the power tool section, I think, where
Mm-hmm.
the consultant can say, I understand the page that I'm dealing with, or the website that I'm dealing with, and I see the bottlenecks, and maybe web page test didn't notice this particular thing that I believe will be helpful. So I
Right.
can go in and say, okay, I'm going to write a find and replace on the HTML of this page and add an attribute to these particular tags in the page, or I'm going to add these script tags to the head of this page and see how
Mm-hmm.
it loads. And that case, like, sounds like a consultant power user sort of thing, but there's
Right.
also an enabling aspect to that for, say you're on a marketing team and you're trying to convince the rest of your team that this chatbot is a good idea to add to the site, and the engineers are like, oh, whoa, 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 this is going to, this is going to influence our page speed. It could slow
Mm-hmm.
down the page. Can you show us the impact, right? And
Mm-hmm.
being able to just say, okay, I'm going to add this script to the end of the body or the end of the head, and here's a comparison, and it shows it's not really, slowing things down. That's
Right.
huge, right?
Yeah.
Um, being able to inject that step versus finding out later that it ruined your metrics because you added something that degraded performance, right? Or caused a accessibility issue.
Right. Right. Yeah. That's
Yeah.
a okay. So I feel like all the other questions that I have are going to be easier if we're looking at something. So I'm going to switch us over to the pair programming view here. Give me just a second. And I'm going to take this opportunity to do a quick shout out to our live captioning. We have White Coat Captioning here with us today. Catherine is doing the captions for us. Those are available on the homepage of learnwithjason.dev. You can head over there if you want to follow along with the captions. And those are made possible through the support of our sponsors. We've got Netlify, NX, and Backlight all kicking in to make this show more accessible to more people, which I appreciate very much. And we are talking today to Scott, so make sure you go and give Scott a follow on Twitter for more insights into all this goodness around perf and all those things. Why is my video being weird? Hold on one second. I got something weird going on with my video here. Here. Yeah, let's just make that a little bit smaller. I think I had it in solo view and edited this source instead of adding a new one like a responsible adult. Okay, that's better. Now I'm not sitting on top of Scott's face. All right, and we're talking today about WebPageTest. I shared this already in the chat, but this is the blog post that kind of introduces all of the things that changed. And this, for anybody who's not familiar, is webpagetest.org. So what's my like entry point here? If we just kind of want to see how things work, what should we test?
Yeah, good question. So first of all, just from the tech side of things on the stream, is there a way that I can see your screen as well?
Oh yeah, there
Sorry about that.
definitely is. I just realized I never. Yeah, give me just one second. I'm going to get this off the
I
screen.
could probably guess, but
Sorry, I don't know why I didn't set that up today. Just really just doing a great job. All right, let me do this, and then you
there
will
it is.
get. If you want
Perfect,
to
perfect.
hover over that, you can. There's three dots. You can copy the embed link and put that in a new tab, and it'll be full size. Okay, so now that Scott can actually see what's going on, and I'm, yeah, all right, let's.
Hey, nice.
All right, chat. As you can see, I'm, it's not like I've done what 300 of these before. Just amateur hour. Okay.
No, this is good.
So
All
what
right.
should my first
Yeah.
step be?
Yeah, so as far as the features that we just talked about go, those sort of happen later after you run a test for the most part. So from here, it's the same as it's been for a while. You can start a test by pasting any website URL in to that box there,
So we can take,
such as
learnwithjason.dev.
sure, and below that,
Oh, I just hit
or
enter. I didn't even.
why don't you shift tab back or shift back uh, just so, yeah. So just below that, there's some configuration. The simple one has some defaults that you can choose from. These are just kind of a favorite selection, I guess, that we have of location, browser, device that you can choose from. So again, cross-browser is kind of like the big deal for web page test. You can run in Edge, Firefox, Safari, Chrome.
And
So
then
those
it
are the
looks like
simple
we got
settings.
options over here
Yeah,
for do it
yeah.
twice
So
and
if you want
then
to test, like your repeat view is for caching. So if you want to test, how a page loads on refresh, um, see if things are cached well in the browser. You can also include a lighthouse audit, and for pro users, which I'll get to. That's our new plan. You see the private option is available there. So you can make a test private.
Yeah,
They're public
and
by default.
maybe we start there just so we set some expectations for everybody on what
Well,
things.
maybe go
Oh,
back.
that's the wrong thing. Nope, that was wrong. Um, how do I get
Yeah.
to?
Well, yeah, that's what I was thinking of. If we go to like opportunities and experiments, not that one.
Not that one. Opportunities and experiments.
Yeah, it's just because you're signed in that
Got it.
you
Got it. Got
can't
it.
see
Okay.
the pages. But from here, if you wanted to, find out about the features, you can compare plans and go from there. Yeah.
Great.
But for a basic rundown of which parts are paid versus which parts are free to anyone with an account. Basically, most experiments, all but one, are part of the paid plan, but we do offer one that you can try as long as you have a free account, and that tends to be the one that improves performance on the most sites, which is the defer render blocking scripts.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah. So so that's pretty neat. Just with a free account, you can get access to trying some experiments. There's also one site that I should mention you can go to your performance result if you want.
Oh yeah, let's do it. I'm gonna
in the okay, so that's still running. You chose 4G connection speed and 3 runs, and that's from Virginia. So it takes a minute. Once that there's always or typically a queue to wait for a test to start from Virginia because it's a popular location.
It's the default, right? Like I just went in there and hit the button.
Yep. Yeah, exactly.
Yep. Okay, so we've got a performance summary. We can see. All right, so got some issues.
Yeah. So if you are new to, or if you haven't been to the site in the last few weeks, this is the section that'll look most familiar to you. We added a little bit above it in the last week or two. That's totally new, and that's the part that sort of starts to tease those opportunities that we've identified in the page that could be improved, either through changes that you make or experiments that you can run.
Mm-hmm.
So that's that section there, but that's just sort of a summary of it. You would have to click through the Explore All to get to them and start to see a little more detail about each of those sections. And they're broken down into 3. These are an early attempt that I think we're moving towards more and more each day with WebPageTest, which is to broaden the sort of diagnostics that we test from strictly just performance-related concerns to usability, accessibility, and resilience. So we've put them into those quickness, usability, and resilient categories, just to kind of organize them as such. But you'll find a lot of non-performance from a strict sense information in those latter 2 categories. For example, under usability, we run the Axe accessibility suite. So we can identify accessibility issues in a page. And I should point out that all those observations are, you don't even need to be logged in to see them. So those are just part of the default test result. So really logging in is where you start to get into the experiments feature, I guess. But yeah, just looking at this result, like if you scroll down into the metrics, you can see this is kind of the standard stuff that you would see all along in WebPageTest. You've got first time first byte, start render, first contentful paint, LCP for largest contentful paint. Everything looks pretty good here. TBT, the total blocking time is a little high, so that's noted in red. And that can be a number of things, but tends to be JavaScript related, like we were talking about. What it refers to though is the amount of time that the main thread is blocked for interaction purposes. So so you get that high level view there, and you can
so if everybody just ignores this one, like just pretend that's not there. Look how good the
right?
Learn with Jason said. Just pat myself on the back
Looking great.
for, and remember this number is not real. Just to ignore that one.
Exactly. Yeah. And uh, of the colored metrics there, those are your core web vitals.
Mm,
So the others in Navy are metrics that we track that aren't included in that set that Google identifies as particularly critical, right?
gotcha.
But you're looking good on LCP. CLS is the layout stability metric.
Mm-hmm.
So that that's a
Should be
big deal
zero.
for should be zero, but you're still very close to zero, and
Mm-hmm.
it's in the good range, so you're not being penalized in search ranking for it. Yeah.
Right, right.
Um, yeah, but more importantly, than just search ranking, you're not loading a page that shifts all over the place as someone's trying to read it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's what that metric tells you.
Yeah.
So yeah, that you have waterfalls here you can click through, and that tells you about the requests that contribute to how the page loads.
This lets us kind of
This
dive
is
into, which is really nice, where we can see like
mhm.
what
Yeah, you
is
see
it
all the
that's
requests that the
blocking
page
everything.
makes. Yep.
So I've
And
got
then
yeah, I've got a bunch of third party stuff. That's probably what it is. So I've got my,
yeah,
my
yeah,
oh,
and
you know why? We just ran
mm,
a test with the live player because we hit the homepage, right? So that would be all the
yep,
time to like load the live player, load the caption thing. So this is also a not a best case scenario for the website.
got it, got it. Well, we could run an experiment in a little bit that tries to get that TBT down.
Yeah,
um,
yeah, yeah.
yeah. Uh, but yeah, let's see. If you scroll back up, so those are your requests, and then you've got if you go back to the or click that film strip, I guess that would be yeah, that would get you into that's the classic film strip view of it's broken down into every half second here, but you can adjust it to 60 frames per second, whatever you'd like.
Oh, nice.
And what's cool about this view is as you scroll it, you can see on the way left of that scrollable pane, there's a little red line with a loop circle at the top.
Mm-hmm.
And that lines up with the same kind of line in the waterfall.
Ooh,
So you
that's
can see
neat.
exactly where requests are being made on a visual timeline. So
Mm-hmm.
um, yeah, and like you already said, there's this is a pretty good, well-performing page. You can see the timeline's pretty like all the requests are kicked off in a line there like that. You know, nothing too staggered. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
suggesting that there's a lot of chained, chained requests. Um, Instead, it's looking pretty good. Yeah. So a couple things that I notice in that waterfall that are potentially interesting, and we could confirm in the opportunities. But you can see in the left column, there's the names of the requests, and two of them are blocking rendering, uh, as that little indicator shows. Yeah,
Got
and
it.
what that
So,
means is they're CSS files that
mm-hmm.
are requested normally, right? And
Mm-hmm.
and a link rel style sheet that
Mm-hmm.
references a CSS file is going to cause the browser to stop what it's doing from a rendering perspective until it can go fetch that CSS and get it ready to present the page in a layout and then proceed, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, Sometimes you can avoid that by loading the CSS in different ways or deprioritizing CSS that you don't need for that initial view. So there are some things you can do. But generally, you kind of want that behavior with
Right,
CSS.
right.
So it's not necessarily a bad thing that
Because
it's
without,
blocking rendering.
like, if we didn't have the CSS, then our cumulative layout shift would be all over the map because the site would like be
Exactly.
unstyled and then styled.
Yep. Yep.
But
So
we
you
could
don't
look at
necessarily want
something
to fix
like,
that one.
depending on how
Mhm.
big it is, we could also look at something like inlining it or things like that
Exactly.
too, right?
Yep. Yep. And that's an example of one of the experiments you could decide to try. So
Oh, cool.
yeah. So I think from here, typically I would go. Well, you can get to it through there. Yeah. Opportunities and experiments is the new section that we
Okay.
launched in the last couple of weeks. And again, it's broken down by quickness, usability, resilience, and each have a series of checks that we ran. And when they're red, that means that we've identified an opportunity, and we either suggest, like in the first one, the time to first byte was slow. We just suggested a tip, like you could try server timing headers to see what's taking a while on your server side, for example, which are surfaced in web page test and kind of useful in that way. But we're not really changing anything with those. We're just suggesting things. These that you're looking at now are experiments. So
Right.
in that first one, we've got a couple. If you spin it down, actually, you can see which one it applies to. Well, if there were more than one, there would be checkboxes, but it's just one in this case. So yeah, you've just got that one render blocking script. And, we looked at the waterfall. It didn't look like that script was necessarily contributing to the first paint. So it may not be blocking at a meaningful time. But if you wanted to test it, you could just click run this experiment, and that would add it to your cart, so to speak.
Nice.
And
Now, if I can share this, like this link here, if I share this with the chat, everybody can go and check that out because I didn't mark it as private, right? All right, so I'm going to throw this in if anybody wants to go explore these results on your own.
And yeah, I mean,
okay.
the only difference between what they'll see and what you're seeing is that the experiments will only be available if you're a pro user.
Got it.
The first one will be available if you're logged in. So
got it.
Yeah.
Okay, so we got a request from Mal Captain to see what it would look like with the CSS inlined. I think that makes sense. Let's
sure,
maybe give it a shot.
So yeah, and we didn't. I actually have a change in the queue to put the file size next to each of those.
Oh, nice.
But it's worth noting that anytime you inline a file, it's going to bloat the size or increase the size of the HTML, and it's not necessarily going to be better, right? It might slow down the page, but it's useful to know. So I would suggest when you're running experiments like inlining, maybe do them one at a time. So just that one, but not like, further experiments down the page. Then you could just hit go and see, okay, what does inlining do?
Yeah. And like there's some things that like for example, maybe what I want to do is I know that you're not going to hit the search when you first hit the page.
Perfect.
So maybe I go async with my search CSS, but inline the main CSS, and let's see if we can solve the whole problem without bloating everything.
Let's try it. Yeah.
All right. I'm going to, do you want to add anything else or should I rerun this?
No, that looks good.
Okay.
So at the bottom, it's going to give you the number of experiment runs that you'd like to run. Generally, the more that you run, the better likelihood that you'll get a reliable comparison, because we're dealing with real network conditions, and sometimes you'll get a slow test result, and we like to be able to kick those out from the end comparison. So WebPageTest will do that by default. When you run more than one test, it'll keep the median run.
And so do you have like in your standard bag of tricks, are you running, is 3 where you go? Do you run 5? Do you run more? Like how many tests do you typically run when you do an experiment?
It really depends. So first of all, just to mention while it's loading what you're looking at here, we've got the experiment run and the control run both kicked off. And the experiment run will apply the 2 tasks that it says are being applied. So they're both applied to that experiment run. So inlining and async. And the control run will have no modification, but it'll go through our experiment proxy anyway. So we can compare both of them that went through the edge function and feel good about the performance being accurate to compare. Okay, so to go back to your question, the number of experiment runs that I like to do really varies on what I'm testing. So if I'm testing, maybe, okay, here's a good one. Say I have a hero image that starts out with no dimensions, and whenever the browser loads it, it suddenly fills the space and pushes text down beneath it, right? So there's no box reserved for that image until it
Mm-hmm.
starts loading. That's kind of the default behavior for an image on the web, right? And
Yeah.
there are ways uh, to avoid that, by, for example, in recent years, browsers have let us start adding back the width and height attributes on an image
Mm-hmm.
to tell the browser to reserve an aspect ratio space for that image, and it will, if you put those attributes on. Now, if I were running a test like that, I only need one run to see if it worked, right?
Sure.
Um, I don't care if it's an outlier and it took 40 seconds to run, even though I have a fast site. I'm just looking for, did it reserve a box until the image started loading, or did it not, right? So in that case,
Mm-hmm.
I just need one. But if I really want to see, a comparison of an optimization that deals with speed, for example, and uh, I want to factor out network uh, reliability,
Mm-hmm.
and differences that just happen, um, then I would do more runs. And I think, 3 is a good minimum. It's kind of, based on how much patience you have, because it's going to take a little while, as you can see here. Um, for each experiment, we run, one experiment run, one control run.
Right.
So it takes a little while.
And
Um,
now the just
yeah,
to recap as we're looking at this to just for anybody who wasn't here earlier is just tuning in now. The way this is working is we are loading the Learn with Jason site through an edge function, and in that's happening in both the experiment and the control. In the
yep,
control, all we're doing is loading it and running the test there. And in the experiment, you're doing HTML transformation to inline that CSS to defer the other CSS, just whatever
yep,
HTML transformation needs to be done to make that work. Um,
yep.
and that's just it's really really cool.
That's it. Yeah, and I should mention that, load CSS asynchronously might sound, to anyone who's unfamiliar with, or is familiar with standard HTML, might say, how are you doing that? Because there isn't really like with JavaScript, we have a defer attribute
Mm-hmm.
to make it load in parallel, but in the same order it's defined. And then we have an async attribute, but we don't have those things with style sheets.
Mm-hmm.
So what we're doing here is this classic kind of workaround hack, that people have been using for a long time, to make a CSS file load asynchronously by first setting its media attribute to print,
Mm-hmm.
and then on load setting it to screen so that it applies. And just by nature of
Oh,
a print style sheet, a browser will load it in parallel, so it won't block render for a print style sheet. So it's kind of a workaround to get low priority style sheets to load that way. So now we're
yeah.
looking at a result, and it looks like we've got a little flash of unstyled content.
Looks like
So,
we got a little bit of weirdness. So there, it's interesting though because looking at this, um, the search text I think it is doing something weird, but it does look like it's making the site faster, which is interesting. So
yeah,
we're getting on screen in like a second earlier than the other one, but
yeah.
then this
So
async thing is doing something weird.
yeah. So again, like we predicted early on, uh, changing the way CSS loads is not necessarily going to be what you want to do, but it will, if you get something out of the critical path to render. It's going to
Mm-hmm.
it's going to let it show something earlier, right? And in
Mm-hmm.
this case, it showed content without styles, which isn't necessarily a keeper.
Well, it's
If
interesting
we're
because it like it loaded the styles, but then it looks like when the async load kicked in, it somehow deleted the other styles or overrode them somehow. So my guess is that this might be all my CSS is processed. This site's built in Remix, and so this CSS might have something happening that when we pull it out, it's somehow no longer referencing the things it's supposed to be, or who knows how this might have actually happened. But
Yeah,
something went
that's
weird
a good
here.
point, because a lot of well, several experiments anyway, um, are designed to work best against sort of like the default way that you would reference a style sheet, or
Mm-hmm.
for example, React sites that you run through this sometimes will give you a different result than you'd expect, because they embed styles like with styled components, for example, in a way that are not easy to retrieve. Um, Looking at the DOM,
Mm-hmm.
um, just the way that they're embedded in there, they're not retrieved in the same way, I guess, when we run the experiment. Those are all things we're trying to improve, because I think the more sites that you throw at this tool and the community runs through it, the more we're noticing cases that we need to address a little better.
Yeah.
So
I
yeah.
have a working theory here. I have a suspicion that this is due to hydration,
Mm-hmm.
because we would have, by running this experiment, what is in the HTML wouldn't match the tracked version in the JavaScript anymore. So it would be
Yeah.
like, oh, I'm missing that node. Let me just delete it or something.
Yeah. Yeah. So anytime the JavaScript is heavily involved in generating or manipulating the styles, it's going to be a little harder to apply these kind of experiments.
Mm-hmm.
But you still got a little useful information here. I mean, just by deferring, getting those links out of the way, the
Mm-hmm.
page showed a lot sooner,
Yeah.
right?
And so, taking that to a more like practical, now that I know this, I could go in and I could look at, like, it looked like this is the only part of the search style sheet that I would need early. So I could
Mhm.
move this button styling into the main style sheet, inline that so that I don't have an external main style sheet. And then this part is all on interaction, right? So I could potentially make sure this only loads when you actually click the search button, which would further decrease the amount of stuff you load, unless you actually run the command K or click the search button to load that
Right,
experience.
right.
So I have it,
Mhm.
without having to write any code, I now have directional information on an optimization I could make for the site.
Right, right. Yeah, so it's useful to know. And sometimes the takeaway is I'm using technology that's going to be difficult to modify, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like in your case, it could be a little harder to make the optimization if this was a successful
Right.
experiment. But it gives you the information at least to be able to act on it.
And so,
Yeah.
so I have my personal site is built with 11D, so it's got less of that.
Cool.
And then I know that you also have one that's like your demo site that I want to pull up and just show.
Oh yeah.
Because this one here is kind of like uh, you intentionally made this bad, which I kind of
Yeah,
love,
it's
right?
sort of like a unit test suite almost
Mm-hmm.
of performance anti-patterns that will cause every diagnostic in our opportunities page to fail.
Should I run one
Um,
of these?
so sure, yeah,
All right, I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna hit this. Do we want to change any of the setup? Should I do one faster, like
um,
desktop?
yeah, sure, that
Okay.
makes sense. Yep, yep,
I'm gonna do desktop. We're gonna start the run, off to the
yep,
races.
yeah. So that one has some identifiable bottlenecks right from the start.
Mm-hmm.
You'll see that'll show up like we're referencing a bunch of scripts in the head of the page that are blocking rendering. So those could be deferred. Of course, we always defer to the developer yourself to know if they can be deferred or not, right? Like you're familiar with that list of scripts, and maybe one of them is very important to rendering the content right
Mm-hmm.
in the top of the page, right? So maybe it won't apply to you, but you at least have that information. So yeah, the metrics are a little different here. We've got a higher largest contentful paint, which suggests something's up with that image of the dog, making it load too slowly. You can see it coming in there, starting at around 3.5 seconds,
Mm-hmm.
finishes at the highlighted red there, 5.5. So something's wrong with that. We could look at that one if you want. There's going to be an experiment related to that. Um, and then in the waterfall, yeah, there's some blocking resources here. There's some redirects. There's some 404s highlighted in red. Uh, lots of stuff.
Yeah, yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
what's the, I guess if you were going to break this down, where would you start with the, so I'm going to go to this opportunities and experiments.
Yeah.
Um,
Or if you started at the performance summary, you would see some of the metrics and, uh, start to formulate a guess on the gaps. Like, for example, my first contentful paint here is pretty good.
mhm,
Less than a second, very good, right? On cable. Um, but LCP is high. So
mhm,
I'm not so concerned about how quickly the HTML was delivered up front. That seems to be pretty good. But
right.
some delay is occurring between that moment and when the what I know to be the largest content, which is that image, that's not showing up as early as I'd like, right? And again, this is on a desktop connection. So the problem would dramatically worsen if you were on 4G, 3G connection, something like
Right,
that.
like because
So
this particular test running on cable, this is like best case scenario.
yep. Yep. So yeah, so from there I would say, okay, let's see what's up with the LCP. I might go to the Web Vitals page. So there's a under the one go up a little bit. That menu. The Web Vitals page is going to highlight if you click the well, you've got it right here. It'll highlight in green
Oh,
the
like this will jump.
part of the
Oh, nice.
content. Yep. So, okay, that's my largest content. It's highlighted there. I can get information on what that the markup is that's driving it, because it might not be an image. It could be a background image for one thing. It could be text.
Hmm.
Sometimes if it's text, it's like font related. Custom fonts taking a while. All sorts of different things. Um, so in this case, it's an image. That's pretty straightforward. And you can see the markup there right off the bat. We've got an anti-pattern, right? Loading equals lazy. Uh, Lazy loading images is kind of one of those things that you classically think as a good idea for performance, right?
Hmm.
Um, but it's only good for images that you want to load slowly. And that's sort of a weird concept, but you want lazy loading on images that are likely to be unimportant. So images that are further down the page, right? And
So
and
so to rephrase that as a heuristic for people who just
yeah,
like me kind of had their jaw drop when you're like, don't use loading lazy. I was like, wait, what? I thought I was supposed to lazy load all my images.
yeah,
The heuristic would be if it's visible above the fold, don't lazy load it.
exactly. And the fold varies
Sure,
depending on
sure.
which device size you're looking at. But generally, if an image is likely to be in the first screen full of content for the user, you don't want a lazy load. And the reason for that is when you put that attribute on an image, it tells the browser to wait until the page renders to decide if it should fetch that image at a high priority or not. If that image is likely to be in the rendered viewport at
Hmm.
load, then it'll fetch it right away. But it still has to wait for the page to visibly render before it goes out and gets it. And
And
that's much later than an image would normally be requested. So,
yeah, and so
uh,
we're like here we're actually, here's the site itself, and then we've got the CSS here. So theoretically,
yep.
we would expect
Ordinarily, you would see that image kicked off right around, zero point 0.2 seconds. This is
right.
very, very fast result. But
So we're waiting a half
instead,
second
it's
just to even
waiting for the
start loading.
green line there.
Yeah.
That green line is when first contentful paint started. So the browser uh, rendered the page, and it said, "Oh, this image is in the viewport. Let's go get it." Right. So that's what lazy loading does, and it actually does that as you scroll down the page or resize your browser. Images come into the viewport, and it says, "Oh, I need to go get this one." Right.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that's good if you're using it for images that are further down the page, because
Mm-hmm.
they're not hogging resources early on in page loading. But in this case, we really want it to hog resources a little better than it is.
Right, right.
So yeah, so right away we've identified our problem here. That request is kicking off way too late, and we even saw the reason
Mm-hmm.
because we happen to know. But if we didn't know, the opportunities page would tell us that. So yeah, if we go to there, We can scroll down to, let's see, yeah, LCP is high. So this will be highlighted anytime it's over 2.5 seconds. We don't vary that timing for the kind of device. We just say 2.5 seconds is a while for
Right.
any user. Expectations have changed with the use of apps, and I think more and more we're trying to standardize on, is it fast or not? And I think more and more users just have an idea of that in their head, right? So uh, we flag it if it's over 2.5 seconds, and it says this is the image that we're dealing with in this case, because it was an image, and we can do a couple things with it. So we can preload it, which would put a link in the head of the page that actually forcefully goes out and fetches that image at a very high priority early on, potentially blocking other requests in its way to go do that. Or we can add a priority hint, which is pretty neat. What that does is adds this attribute, fetch priority high, which is something that so far is only Chromium browsers, so Edge and Chrome, but other browsers just ignore it, so it's harmless. It'll add that to the image itself, and you can add those to
Okay.
a variety of different things like scripts or style sheets as well. But you could go ahead and click that one. But the other thing that we know we're going to want to apply here is this next one. Images within the initial viewport are being lazy loaded. So that's a big deal, right? That lines up with the problem that we saw. So what this will do is remove that loading equals lazy attribute from the image. So you could run those two, and we don't have to wait for it if you don't want to. But what it would do is cause the browser to kick off that request very early because of the priority hint. So it would see that high priority when it discovers the image,
Right.
and say, oh, this one needs to go right away. And then the lazy loading attribute would not fight with it.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. So,
so that's
okay.
pretty cool.
And so scrolling through here, it looks like we got a few other things. So we could load, like fonts so that they are visible. That helps with the content shift or cumulative layout shift.
Yep.
Third party hosts. Okay.
Yeah, like fonts that are on a third party, it's going to take a little longer to make a connection to that domain and then get the font. So you can try self-hosting it instead, which just WebPageTest just mimics how it would act if it was on your own server. Yeah, so a lot of things dealing with fonts there. One thing that I did want to get to that we didn't talk about yet is if you scroll all the way past the opportunities to the bottom, there's that create section.
Oh,
and
yeah.
that's that power tool feature that if you spin that open, this one is really neat because we're not recommending any changes from here down. It's just kind of a playground for you to apply anything that you'd like to. So if you wanted to insert some arbitrary HTML into the page, say like a script tag, into
So we
the
can,
end of the head, or
so we could add something, to the end of the body. We could do like do something like that, throw something in, and then we can also do something like this where we like do a web page to butts.
Yep, exactly.
Okay.
The classic browser extension. Yep.
Exactly.
And
so
yeah.
let's
Yep, and that'll apply either one off, or you could run a regular expression and match all the instances in the page and change them.
Let's do it.
My my colleague Tim over at WebPageTest yesterday found a really cool one where this page was had preloaded, I think it was almost 400 CSS files accidentally, and it was just it was taking, I can't remember how long. It was a really long time before it could display the page, and he was able to run a find and replace that just found all the link rel preloads and removed them from the page, and sped it up dramatically. And that's in his Twitter account if you want to check it out. But yeah, really useful.
All right.
So yeah, you've run a number of experiments there.
Yeah, so we've got we're running just a few. We're gonna do the priority hint and the lazy loading fix for the images, and then we added
Mhm.
some custom HTML, and we did the find and replace, just to kind of show those power tools. Now these are not really useful ways of doing it, but we could dig in a little bit
Right.
more, and like you said, I'm gonna go find this tweet from Tim actually.
Yeah. Actually, Henri just dropped it in the chat, so you don't
Oh,
have to
perfect.
find it. Yeah.
Always rely on Henri.
There it is, though. Either way. We've been trying to highlight some interesting experiments
I'm
each
gonna
day.
double drop it in here because I have a bot that pulls all the links I post for show notes. Um,
Yeah, so this
Extremely
one was pretty
cool.
cool. If you click through to that one, it has I think it was like a 6-second faster first paint just by removing preloads. And this was on a live site, so it's not just the
Mm-hmm.
the sandbox site, but a good test case. And if you want to see the experiment that was run, you can open that little menu there, and it'll the find replace text one will show you.
Oh, nice.
Yes, there. Yep. So just a little regular expression that finds. We need to add a field that shows the replacement, but it was blank. So yeah, it just took all those out, and you can see that the page paints
Makes a huge
dramatically
difference.
faster.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, we should send that off to them.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, so that's kind of the essence of the tool.
It's this is like really exciting stuff, and I hope the folks in the chat got their gears turning about ways that this is just gonna give you an automatic upgrade on the way that you measure perf. You don't necessarily have to do it manually. You can just dive right in and try it, right? Like you don't have to go and code it yourself. You don't have to do really anything hyper specialized.
Yeah,
You can just click a button and see if it's better. Which is,
don't
that
necessarily know what to test or need to know what to test.
yeah.
So
So let
right.
me ask, because we're running up on the end of the hour here. Where
Yeah.
should people go if they want to learn more?
Yeah. So the on Twitter, the real WebPageTest account is where you can keep up to date on WebPageTest stuff. There's also webpagetest.org that you've been showing a great deal. You can get a free account on there to start running at least one of the experiments, and go from there if you want to upgrade. So that's the best place to start.
Mm-hmm.
Beyond that, if you want to see what I'm up to, Scott Gel on Twitter, you can find me there. Oh, and I should mention that each week we have our own live stream on Twitch that is usually an audit, kind of like we just did, where we just open up real sites on the web and run experiments on them. And so yeah, you can check out our Twitch feed for that. Web page test live, I believe we
Oh,
call
web
it.
page test live. Okay.
Yeah. So
And let's see. No, that's not it either.
I'm sure Henri will probably drop the link either way. Looks like he's in the chat.
Web page. Oh, just straight up web page test. There it is. Let's drop this
Yeah,
in.
cool.
And let's see. Am I following? I think so. Yes, I am. Okay, great. Yeah, so
Cool.
this has been a lot of fun. Let's see if we got our results back. We did. Okay, so this gave us got a little bit of these, but I think this one's kind of to be expected, where we knew it was going to block a little bit more because we're not doing the lazy loading.
Yep. Yeah, so what did we do? We oh right, the priority hint, yeah.
We did the priority hint. We did
Yeah, so
the
oh, the find and replace text. Yeah, which you I think you added it to the end of the body, so it probably wouldn't show up in that oh, perfect. web page to butts. There you go. and and I mean, really, what else are we here for? Right?
Exactly. But we did get this big one that we were thinking of is the first contentful paint goes way down. The largest contentful paint went down, and so we get a better experience overall.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of. I guess we were trying to optimize the image, and it looks like we didn't get the LCP loading faster, and that's probably because we didn't also defer the scripts that came before it. So there was, a couple of things that you'd probably want to combine in one experiment to say, you can test some things in isolation, but since these metrics are additive, often you need to combine them in smart ways to get the result you're looking for. So I think I would go back and defer those scripts, get them out of the waterfall, that kind of thing. But yeah.
Cool. Well, Scott, we are out of time, so I'm gonna take this opportunity to shout out one more time to the captioning. We've had Catherine here today with White Coat Captioning, taking down all of these words. Thank you very much for that.
That's great.
That's made possible by our sponsors, Netlify, NX, and Backlight, all kicking in to make the show more accessible to more people. And we've got just so many good things coming up on the show. Next week, we're going to learn Blender. I am very excited about that. Do some 3D rendering with Prince, who is, Prince has got to be one of my favorite people on the entire planet. We're going to do visual page building with Plasmic. We're going to have Sunil from Cloudflare come on. We're going to talk about edge computing and how this whole, if you're interested in how all of this is enabled with how, WebPageTest is using edge functions, don't miss this episode with Sunil, because we're going to talk a whole lot about just what it is, like why it's different than serverless or traditional hosting or any of the other things, and just what it unlocks, right? So that's going to be a really, really fun episode. With that, I think that's
awesome. Thank you so much for having me. This was fun.
This was a blast. Any parting words for the chat before we call this one a success?
No, I think we covered it. Thank you so much.
All right, Scott. Fun. Thank you so much for hanging out with us. Chat, as always, thank you for spending some time with us today. We're going to go find somebody to raid. We will see you all next time.
All right. Take care. Thanks, Jason.